right, so, we've talked a lot about pensions on the show, but I feel like we really need to zero in on something specific for this episode.
Okay, yeah, what are you thinking?
Well, I think about a lot of our listeners and their connection to the UK, right? Like maybe they spent years working there, building their careers, contributing to the system, and now life's kind of taken them elsewhere.
Yeah, definitely a common story.
And, maybe some are even thinking about moving back at some point.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Did that time in the UK really, truly set them up for a secure financial future? And I'm talking specifically about the UK state pension, because that could be a much bigger deal than people realize.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is huge, especially for those who've spent a good chunk of their working lives in the UK and are now overseas or maybe thinking about heading back. Getting a handle on their UK state pension situation, it's not just important, it's like potentially life-changing. We're talking about guaranteed income in retirement that's linked to inflation. That's like a real safety net.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're diving deep into today. We're going to sift through all the official UK guidance on national insurance. And plus, we've got this really insightful briefing document that highlights, well, a kind of limited time offer you might not want to miss, instead of everyone having to dig through those government websites themselves.
Yeah, totally. And, these sources, they give us the nitty-gritty on how you can actually look at your own national insurance record. And what's even more exciting is that they point to a real chance to boost your future state pension. It's all about understanding what you've already earned and whether you can give it a little nudge upwards, especially before this deadline hits.
So to be super clear, our goal today is to give you, the listener, the essentials about your UK state pension prospects, especially if you've got UK work history and are now living abroad or thinking about returning. We want to cut through all the noise, all the jargon, and make sure you're completely in the know about this opportunity because, honestly, it could have a massive impact on your retirement income. No headaches, just the facts. So let's kick things off with the basics. What actually is the UK state pension?
Well, put simply, the UK state pension is a regular payment that comes from the government, and it starts when you hit the official state pension age. It's basically a foundation for your retirement income, a reliable base to build upon.
And it's not exactly small change, is it? What's the current amount, looking at our sources?
Oh, yeah, you're right. It's a decent sum. The full state pension at the moment is around $152 per week, which totals up to something like $7,904 annually. And here's the kicker, according to the briefing. For a good chunk of retirees, around 60%, the state pension makes up like half their total retirement income. That's significant. Plus, it's guaranteed and it tends to rise with inflation, so it's a real safeguard against, everything going up in price.
That inflation protection is sounding more and more important these days. So to get this full pension, how many years do you actually need to have worked and contributed?
Right. So you need at least 10 qualifying years of national insurance contributions to receive any state pension at all. But to get the full amount, you're looking at around 35 qualifying years. These are years where you've either paid enough national insurance, received credits for it, like during times of unemployment or illness, or in certain cases, made voluntary contributions.
Okay, qualifying years. That takes us to national insurance contributions, right? Remind us, what are they and how do they become those crucial qualifying years?
Sure. National insurance contributions are payments that go towards funding a bunch of state benefits, and of course, the big one for us, the state pension. If you've been employed in the UK, you'll be familiar with these contributions because they're usually taken directly out of your wages. That's what's known as Class 1 national insurance. Now, if you were self-employed, you probably paid Class 2 or Class 4 contributions. It depended on how much you were earning. And each tax year where you pay enough national insurance or get those credits usually counts as one qualifying year towards your state pension.
So miss a year, you potentially miss out on a qualifying year. Makes sense. But, things get a bit tricky for those who've been working outside the UK, right? Gaps can start to show up in their national insurance record, yeah.
Exactly. If you've built a career in the UK and then moved overseas, there are a few ways these gaps can pop up. You might have had periods when you weren't working while abroad, or maybe you were just, not working in the UK and therefore not contributing to the system. And we can't forget about something from the past, too. Some folks were actually contracted out of the state pension. This meant they paid less national insurance because they were accruing benefits in a different kind of pension scheme, often a private one. But this can have a knock-on effect on how many qualifying years you have for the full state pension today.
Contracted out. Can you quickly unpack that for us? Like, if someone was contracted out, how does it affect their state pension now?
So when you were contracted out, you and your employer paid lower national insurance contributions. And in exchange, you were building up benefits in a workplace pension. You still gained qualifying years, but the amount of state pension you're entitled to might be less than the full amount because you weren't fully contributing during those contracted out years. But don't worry, when you look at your state pension forecast, it should tell you if being contracted out has affected you.
Good to know. So these gaps can be a real pain if you're aiming for those 35 years for the full pension. But our briefing doc keeps mentioning this, like golden opportunity to actually fix those gaps. What's the deal there?
This is where things get really interesting and honestly a bit urgent. There's a limited time window right now where you can make voluntary national insurance contributions to plug those gaps in your record, going all the way back to the 2006-2007 tax year. This is not something you see every day. Normally, you can only go back a few tax years to catch up on missed contributions, usually the last 6.
And what's the catch? Why is this window closing, and why is it so important for our listeners to act now?
The date you absolutely need to remember is April 5th, 2025. That's the deadline. After that, your ability to backdate those voluntary contributions that far back basically vanishes. You'll likely only be able to fill gaps from the past 6 tax years. So this extended period going all the way back to 2006 is a real time-limited opportunity.
The briefing actually mentions that this extended deadline came about because, well, loads of people wanted to take advantage of it.
Yeah, spot on. There was huge demand, and the government decided to extend the window so that more people could benefit. And here's another plus. The cost of these voluntary national insurance contributions has been frozen at the rates from the years you're making up. So you won't be paying today's rates for contributions from way back when. That can be a real saver.
This all sounds super relevant for our listeners, especially those who put in the time in the UK and are now living abroad, or maybe thinking of coming back. How does this opportunity actually benefit them in real practical terms?
It can be a real game changer, especially if you worked in the UK for a good while and then moved on. There might be several years where you weren't contributing, and this window gives you a chance to fill those gaps. The potential return on investment is what's so exciting. The briefing gives a great example. A fairly small sum, something like 824 lalanists for a missing year between 2006 and 2012, could add, get this, about $328 per year to your state pension for the rest of your retirement.
Wow, that's a pretty decent bump for a manageable cost. I mean, that's something to pay attention to.
It really is. And the briefing points out that you'd only need to live for a little over 2.5 years after reaching state pension age to break even on that investment. And when you think about how long people are living these days, that makes it a really smart long-term boost to your retirement income, especially with that added protection against inflation we talked about earlier.
And the cost isn't always that 824 figure, right? I seem to recall something about it potentially being even less in certain cases.
Absolutely. There are cases where the cost of making up a qualifying year can be considerably less, like if you were self-employed in the UK, or even if you're living abroad now but had a period of self-employment back in the UK, you might qualify to make voluntary Class 2 national insurance contributions. These are way cheaper, potentially as low as around £179 for a year. The briefing even paints a picture where, say, investing around £1,000 to buy back 5 missing years could give you an extra £6,640 per year in state pension, which over a typical retirement could add up to a whopping £32,000. Of course, these are just examples, and your specific circumstances will dictate the actual costs and benefits.
So for anyone listening who's thinking, hold on, this could be me, what's the very first thing they should do?
The absolute first step is to get a good look at your national insurance record. The UK government website, gov.uk, has a really user-friendly service where you can check this online. You'll need to set up an account or sign in if you've already got one. And they might ask you to confirm who you are with something like your passport or driving license. It's all about keeping your information safe.
And once you're in, what kind of info are you actually going to see?
You'll see a complete breakdown of all the national insurance contributions you've made up to the beginning of the current tax year, any credits you've earned, like if you were on unemployment benefits, and most importantly, it'll highlight any gaps. These are the years where you didn't contribute enough to qualify for the state pension. They'll be labeled as non-qualifying years. The service will usually tell you if making voluntary contributions to fill those gaps would be beneficial, and even give you an estimate of how your state pension forecast would change if you did, including the potential cost. Sometimes you can even pay those voluntary contributions right there on the website.
What if someone's living abroad and can't easily access the online service, or they just prefer a more, I don't know, traditional way of doing things, are there other options for checking their record?
Definitely. You can always request a printed statement of your national insurance record. If you're still in the UK, you can usually do this online. But if you're overseas, you can request it online, by mail, or even give them a call. Whichever way you choose, you'll usually need to specify which tax years you want to see. It's also worth noting that you can't generally request statements for the current or the previous tax year. And if all else fails, you can always write directly to HMRC, that's HM Revenue and Customs. Oh, and one more thing. This is important for anyone who might have worked in the Isle of Man. If you paid national insurance there and reached state pension age after April 5th, 2016, your UK record won't include those contributions, so you'll need to contact the Isle of Man's National Insurance Office separately.
Got it. So let's say someone's checked their record and they've spotted some gaps, maybe even stretching back to 2006. What are some smart things to consider when deciding whether or not to make these voluntary contributions?
Well, the briefing document has some handy strategic tips. One is to prioritize filling the cheapest gaps first. Those could be years where you earned something, but not quite enough for a qualifying year, or, as we mentioned before, years where you might be able to use those lower-cost Class 2 contributions because of self-employment, either in the UK or potentially even while you were living abroad. Another crucial tactic, especially with that looming deadline, is to really focus on buying back the older years first, those between 2006 and 2019. Those are the ones that will likely become off limits after April 5th, 2025. If your budget's a bit tight, hitting those older years first makes the most sense so you don't miss out altogether.
It's natural to wonder, especially with all the economic uncertainty in the world, what about the future of the state pension itself? Our briefing does touch on that, right?
It does. It acknowledges that people are worried about whether the state pension will be around forever, especially with an aging population and potential changes down the line. Things like increasing the state pension age or tweaking how it increases each year. However, the briefing makes a very interesting point. Using the current state pension amounts, the break-even point for these voluntary contributions, meaning the time it takes for the extra pension you get to equal what you paid in, is pretty short in a lot of cases, often around that 2.5-year mark we mentioned earlier. This means that even if the state pension changes in the future, making these contributions now could still be a very sound investment for many, giving you guaranteed inflation-proof income for what could be a long retirement. The briefing even suggests that even a large reduction in the state pension in the future would probably still mean a reasonable break-even period for this investment, given typical life expectancies.
So for our listeners who are currently abroad or thinking about going back to the UK, if they're even a little bit curious about all this, what are the absolutely essential next steps they should take right now?
The most important thing is to check your state pension forecast and your national insurance record online. Head over to the gov.uk website to do that. We'll make sure to put the link right there in our show notes so it's easy to find. https://www.gov.uk check-national insurance record. That'll give you a clear, personalized picture of your situation. The briefing strongly recommends getting personalized advice from a financial advisor who knows their way around cross-border financial matters, especially for those living outside the UK or thinking about moving back.
Actually, we have a recommendation for our listeners who might be looking for that kind of expert help, especially those living abroad.
Yes. The briefing highlights Adrian Rolls, a financial advisor based in Dubai, as a great example of someone with tons of international experience who can provide specialized advice to people living overseas with UK pension interests. He's a real expert on the ins and outs of international financial planning and UK pensions. And the great thing is, he's offering a free initial consultation to our listeners. We'll include a link directly to his online calendar where you can book a time that works for you. https://calendly.com/Adrian And just a heads up, with the deadline coming up fast, government helplines are likely to be swamped, so be prepared for a bit of a wait if you decide to contact them directly.
That's super helpful to have that specific recommendation. Any final but crucial things our listeners should know before taking the leap?
Absolutely. Don't just jump in and make payments for those voluntary national insurance contributions without being absolutely sure it will actually increase your state pension. For example, if you were contracted out of the state pension for certain periods, paying for those specific years might not give you the full boost you're expecting. It's also worth checking if you can fill those gaps for less money, or even free, because of your particular circumstances. For instance, if you were self-employed while living abroad, you might still be eligible for those cheaper Class 2 contributions. There can be some tricky details here, so do your homework and get professional advice if you're unsure about anything before you hand over any money.
Okay, so the big takeaway here is that time is ticking on a potentially big opportunity. April 5th, 2025 is the deadline to backdate those voluntary national insurance contributions all the way back to 2006. For anyone out there who's worked in the UK for a good while and are now living abroad or thinking of heading back, this is a real chance to boost your future UK state pension, which, as we've said, is a guaranteed inflation-proof income that could make a real difference in your retirement. Don't miss out.
Absolutely. So the message for our listeners is clear. Don't wait. Head over to the gov.uk website today and check both your national insurance record and your state pension forecast. And seriously consider getting in touch with a financial advisor who knows the global scene, someone like Adrian Rowles, to go over your situation and figure out if making those voluntary contributions is right for you. This window of opportunity won't be open forever, so get moving.
And on that note, here's something to think about. Taking control of your financial future often means recognizing and acting on opportunities like this. Your time working in the UK was valuable, and this limited window allows you to potentially turn that past effort into greater financial security during your retirement, wherever you decide to settle down. Don't see this as just another chore, but as a real opportunity to potentially build a better financial future for yourself, building on your UK experience. Thanks for tuning in to this deep dive.